because I want to be clear. I hope you felt it and that I was sincere when I said this framework is beautiful. This framework is so wonderful. The problem is not in these words, not in these concepts. The problem is in its implementation. The problem is that the reality, the founding of this country, is a founding violence. It's a founding violence against the indigenous human beings who already lived here and were subject to intentional, deliberate genocide. That is the truth. The tragedy is that it's a founding violence against the Africans who were brought at the barrel of a gun or the point of a spear and forced to build this country. This country was built with slave labor. The White House that Barack Obama currently occupies was built by enslaved Africans. That's the truth. It's a founding violence against women, because it's not just, ma'am, that women couldn't vote. That's the least of it. Women at this time could not even own property. Women were property by any reasonable understanding of that word. And in fact, women couldn't even enter into contracts. And do you know why? Because women were said to lack the capacity to make legally binding obligations. They were like children legally. And it's a founding violence against most of the white men, because most of the white men were actually not legally persons because they were not sufficiently wealthy to be able to actually fully participate in this beautiful framework. And that's the truth as well. And I tell all those truths not so I can wallow in some kind of ridiculous guilt about it. I have no use for guilt. Guilt is a useless emotion unless and until it motivates future conduct. So here's a bit of free pop psychology advice from me. If you're ever feeling guilty about something, then stop doing whatever it is that you're doing or thinking about that's making you feel guilty. Ta-da! But actually, I really want to focus on this is because I think that Nelson Mandela got it right. When Nelson Mandela said, when you are in an utterly unjust situation or circumstance, the only way to peacefully transform it is to create a truth and reconciliation process. You have to be willing to tell the truth about any injustice that you may have perpetrated, or be willing to tell the truth about the injustice that you received, and then both of you have to be able to move past it and create a process by you actually reconcile those things so that you can create justice. You see, as a white man, I think it's important that white people talk about racism in this country. White people only, will you answer me? Will you start doing that?
Yes.
Good. Men only. Will we start talking about the sexism that is inherent and endemic in this country?
Yes.
Yes. So you see, I think that if and when we create a genuine truth and reconciliation process, then we can actually create the world that we want to live in. And I want to say this. The reason that I go into this is because I think the late, great historian Howard Zinn got it right. And may the goddess bless his soul. Howard Zinn said that history requires a lens to look back on. And the most important lens in looking at U.S. history is as a series of struggles by ordinary human beings to be described as persons with rights protected by our Constitution. That's so important, I'm going to say it again. The most important way to look at U.S. history is as a series of struggles by actual human beings to be defined as legal persons with constitutionally protected rights. Now, some people might say, all right, Cobb, you got a scathing indictment about imperialism of 500 years ago. But hey, man, we got rid of slavery. Women can vote. It's all good. To which I say, au contraire, mon frere. It ain't all good. It ain't all good at all. And I think now it's time and would be helpful if we reintroduce the idea of the corporation. After all, I think that the problem today is not just corporate power. Right? Corporations are not just exercising power. They're ruling us. They're making the fundamental public policy decisions that affect our lives. Right? So let's actually, if we found this helpful, and y'all have found this helpful, right? And if I'm correct that there's a difference between sovereign and subordinate, if I'm correct that there's a difference between rights and duties, if I'm correct that there's a difference between private and public, and I am, then it might be useful for us to put this institution, this construct known as a corporation within this framework, And in order to do it, I'll ask this very quick question. Does anybody know what it takes to form a corporation in Connecticut today?
$250.
That's exactly right. He said this. It's $250, and you forgot to say you have to file some paperwork. You have to fill out a form, and as long as you've dotted your I's and your T's are crossed and your check clears, the Secretary of State will issue you what? A charter. And that charter actually literally creates the corporation. By the way, how long can your corporate charter last today?
Forever.
Forever. What can you do with a corporate charter under Connecticut law? In the Connecticut corporate code, it literally says anything that is legally permissible. Some of us say, well, apparently, if you're big enough and powerful enough, you can do illegal things too. Put that aside for a moment. I just really want to contextualize this construct that we are creating and that our state legislature is creating and what that means. And to tell you that in 1789, to create a corporation required a bill to get introduced in the lower house of the Connecticut Assembly, and it had to pass by a majority. And then that same bill had to go to the Connecticut Senate, and it had to pass by a majority, and then the governor had to sign it. What does that sound like today? That process is called what?
Act of Congress.
A law. It's a law, right? It's the Connecticut lawmaking process. Anybody besides me try to pass a law, get a law passed? How hard is that? There's actually a term of art in the law too. Real damn hard! I mean, it's just mechanically incredibly difficult to get laws passed. The point I'm making is that there was a time in our history, and for the first 75 to 100 years of American history, that getting the privilege, not the right, but the privilege of limited liability and incorporation required an incredible process. And to engage that process, you had to prove that there was a public need that was not being met either by existing private businesses or by governmental practice. And if you were given the privilege, not the right, but the privilege of incorporation at that time, and you ever did anything other than that very specific thing that you had identified, do you know what happened? Not only was your corporate charter revoked if you did anything other than the very specific thing that you had given the charter. Here's another question. How long would your corporate charter typically last? 10 years was the normal amount of time. Some were a little bit longer, some were actually shorter. But the point I'm making is that for the first 75 to 100 years in U.S. history, the process of incorporating was limited. They were very specific time periods. And at the end of that time period, do you know what happened to the corporate charter then? It automatically dissolved. It was gone, and you didn't have to be doing anything wrong. It's just the term had ended, and if anybody wanted to continue to do that type of business or that thing, they had to go through the process all over again. Oh, and by the way, even if you were doing the very specific thing that you had been granted a charter to do, and even if it was during that very limited time period that you had been granted your charter, if you ever did anything to act outside of the public interest, do you know what happened to your corporate charter? It was revoked. A corporate charter could be revoked just for acting outside the public interest. The point I'm making, folks, is if it is true that only an act of state government can create the privilege of limited liability and incorporating, if that corporate charter can be used to hold the corporation accountable, if the corporate charter describes the duties for what the corporation can be, and if the corporation should only exist if it's acting in the public interest, can you understand why I and others argue that a corporation properly should be understood to be on this side of the line? Doesn't that make sense? Right? And so when the U.S. Supreme Court comes waltzing in and says, actually no, we're going to say that a corporation should be considered a person with actual inherent rights under the Constitution, it perverts this whole framework. See, that's the linchpin of it all. Corporate personhood is not just a stupid idea, which it is. Corporate personhood is not just illogical, which it is. Corporate personhood is the idea that a corporation can claim to be a person with the same rights that human beings have, and therefore the democratic process cannot control them. Corporate personhood is the reason that the ruling elite have been able to hijack our very country. They have been able to hijack the institutions. And the thing that really chaps my that really makes me angry today, there's a difference between a university and a union hall, David Cobb. One thing that really makes me angry today is the fact that most of the harms and abuses that these huge transnational corporations do, I am told, we as a people are told, it's legal. And even if we're able to work our butts off to get a law passed, corporate lawyers can come waltzing into court and overturn that law on the basis that the rights of a corporation have been violated by the democratic process itself. And so, folks, I'm going to end by telling you, in order to address this, it's not just one law. It's not just one thing. It is actually what we would call as lawyers a legal doctrine. That legal doctrine of corporations being persons, that corollary legal doctrine that money must be thought of as political speech and therefore cannot be properly regulated, these doctrines are undermining the integrity of the democratic republic. So no matter what your ideology is, left or right or middle, no matter what political party you're in, Democrat, Republican, Green, Libertarian, don't like any party at all, doesn't matter. All of us, I hope, can understand that we want and deserve the democratic republic that Mrs. Armstrong told me about, that your teachers taught you about, that we are taught the United States of America is supposed to be. And I'm proud to tell you that there is a movement to do just exactly that. And we do talk about ourselves as a movement. It's a movement called Move to Amend. Move to amend the U.S. Constitution to make it clear that only human beings have these constitutional rights, that money is not speech, and that we the people have the sovereign right to self-government. We have the right to decide how to best protect our communities, how to protect the environment, what kind of economy we want to have, how to protect the integrity of our elections. And so I'm going to invite you now, if you would like to join this movement, I'm going to pass around clipboards, old-fashioned style. And I want to be very clear as this comes around that if you don't want to join, I will not be offended. Just pass the clipboard. I promise I won't be offended. I'll be surprised, quite honestly. But I get surprised all the time. So don't worry about that. But I will say that if you're going to sign this, and I hope you will, if you're going to be willing to sign it, the only thing I ask is please print legibly. As an organizer, there's nothing more frustrating than not to be able to read it. The second thing I'll say is this. Whether you're a student or a member of the community, if you want to sign and just like be getting monthly notes from us, just sign up. That's fine. But if you actually say, not only that, but I want to actually get involved in helping to form a Move to Amend affiliate, either here at the University of Connecticut, New London, as a student group, or in your own community, you want to become an organizer, just put an asterisk next to that, right? And if you don't want to, just pass it. And then now I will stop and ask if anybody would like to ask a question, make a comment, including saying, David, this is great, or David, you're a dangerous un-American, or this won't work, I wish it would, or any other comment or question. Just raise your hand and hold it up. Sir, you'll be number 1. Ma'am, you'll be number 2. Sir, you will be number 3. Sir, you'll be number 4. Ma'am, number 5. So this little stack we'll go through, and if you haven't ever seen this process that I just did, that's called a stack. And the reason that we do that is so that we can share time together. So numbers 2 through 5, relax. You're going to get to ask your question or make your comment. You can do what I'm going to do and all the rest of us are going to do and give our full attention to number 1. Yes?
Thanks very much. I'd just like to, one comment and one question. Comment is, there's a General Assembly in KV Common Room starting in 2 minutes. If anyone can make it after the presentation, it's to discuss similar issues. It's in response to the Occupy Wall Street movement, and there are people from the community in New London and elsewhere. The question is there a web petition that you have, or would you like to give out petitions? Because we have about 100 students congregating right there, and most of them would be willing to sign it. So
the answer is yes. There is a web petition. The answer is yes. I've got some materials here. Could I get one of the back of those petitions? Ma'am, could I stop just long enough to get, would you pick up the clipboard thing right here? And if you'd be willing to make photocopies of this, and I'm going to give you these to take to those students. I'm going to give you this. and I'm going to give you my personal card because we have actually been working. I've spoken to about a dozen of the occupation movements across the country. Sunday, I'm going to New York City to talk to the folks at Occupy Wall Street. I want to thank you for what you're doing, brother. And I want to also say this very clearly, both on video to this gentleman, to everybody else. The Move to Amend effort wants to work with and talk with the occupation movement, not talk to the Occupy movement. We recognize that there is a movement that is going on that is organic, it is horizontal, it is bubbling up. I am a self-described anarchist politically myself. That's right, an anarchist who ran for president. I believe in using all the tools. I ain't joking. And so, like, as one horizontalist to another, I definitely want to figure out ways to work with y'all. I will point out that the End Corporate Personhood meme is one of the very most popular demands that are coming up out of occupations everywhere. We have a strategy for how to do that. We want to work with you. So thanks again. All right. Number 2. Yes, ma'am.
I first want to know where the conference room is.
It's Captain Blunt Dorm. It's on Central Campus. Any student
I'm going there afterwards, so anybody who wants to walk with me, get to me here right now.
I have a comment and a question too. The comment
Thanks for coming, brother.
Yes, you are a dangerous human being. And that is a good thing.
You know, actually, I just got to say very quickly that does anybody know who Lucy Parsons is? Lucy Parsons was the widow of one of the Haymarket massacres. She was actually from Texas like me, and unlike me, she was a woman, and she was also an African American. And the Chicago Police Department said because of her oratory skills and her organizing abilities, she was more dangerous than the people who threw the bombs. Just saying. Words and good stories are very powerful. Yes?
And it's fine if you want to leave this for later, but what I'm really interested in is, well, what is the next actual action step?
Perfect. I'm glad you
What
did.
we're talking about is amend the Constitution, state by state, legislature by legislature. Well, then what? Just to get us started.
This much. Thank you for doing that because so here's the thing. In Connecticut, y'all are blessed with the ability to pass locally non-binding referendums and even state referendums. Our vision is this. You start at the local community and pass resolutions calling for an amendment to the U.S. Constitution to abolish corporate personhood and to establish that money is not speech. And that those amendments, or those resolutions, have already passed in Humboldt County, California, in Madison, Wisconsin, in Dane County, in South Central Pennsylvania, in Maine, in New Hampshire. So we've already had tremendous success. And next week, is it? Election day? Yeah, I think it's next week. Next week, voters in Boulder, Colorado, and Missoula, Montana will also be voting on that. My hope is that by primary season, next election cycle, that there are places in Connecticut that are actually doing that. In other words, it starts to bubble up all across the country. Local people are working, and check this out. You don't need a political party to champion this idea. You don't need candidates. You just need people who are willing to come together. So it gives you an opportunity to work across party lines. And can I say very explicitly, Greens and Democrats need to learn how to work together. And this is a great way to do it. And Republicans who want to work on this, I pledge I will welcome you. And we will actually work together on these principles. So the short answer is local resolutions that begin to get passed all over the country. And then within a year or two at the state level. And then ultimately we will begin to elect candidates to office at the local, county, state, and even federal level who are championing this idea. And ultimately the Constitution will be amended, I honestly believe, within 10 to 15 years, that's about how long it's going to take for this movement to get so broad and so deep and the wave to actually come crashing over. So that's our strategy in a nutshell. If you had a follow-up, or did that make sense to you? Number 3. Yes, sir.
If the Constitution says we the people are free and sovereign and we have these rights, how can you amend that? I mean, it already says it.
No, but well, the problem is that that's what the Constitution says this. The court has said that a corporation is also considered a person with constitutional rights.
So the amendment
Would say only human beings are persons with constitutional rights, and money is not speech. And may I go one step further, sir, and say that when this movement is really picking up steam, I think that we should begin to recognize that a constitution is the legal codification of the social contract. And that really what we're talking about is renegotiating the social contract. Because I'll now speak only for myself at this point. The Move to Amend Coalition is a democratic, accountable organization. So we haven't gone through this, but I'll say David Cobb says, can we also include a demand for health care as a right that is guaranteed under our government? Can we also talk about the guarantee to a right to enough food to eat under our Constitution, a right to clean air and clean water? So the point is, what we're talking about is constitutional renewal. I'll say it very honestly, and I will say it publicly. And whoever's watching this, by the way, just acknowledge that you're watching it because you're watching independently created and produced media. Don't hate the corporate media. Become your own media. So the point that I'm making right now is we're talking about a democracy movement. Another way to say it, and I will say this very clearly, a nonviolent revolution. That's how we're thinking. That's what we're talking about. And let's be clear that this is revolutionary. It's a revolution in values. It's a revolution in justice. It's a revolution, but it is also nonviolent. I am committed to nonviolence because that's the only way we can create the peaceful world that I want to be part of. And so I'm going to stand up directly and challenge the corporatists and the militarists who have hijacked this country, who have hijacked this culture, and say, you are going away. You're done. We're recreating something. So the way we do it, sir, you're right, that's the amendment process. But I want to really ask you and me and all of us to really dig even deeper and recognize that as big as it is to amend the Constitution, what we're talking about is our culture. What we're talking about is what are our real values. And I believe that we're able to do this in a way that is actually going to find its way into the Constitution as surely as the women's rights movement did, as surely as the abolitionist movement did, as surely as all the other great movements did. Number 4. Yes, ma'am. I'll come back to you.
This is great. Was I wrong about being 4?
You are 4.
Okay. You make a distinction between private corporations, nonprofit corporations, and public corporations that are privately traded. I mean,
I can make those distinctions for sure.
I mean, wasn't the most recent Supreme Court decision about campaign funding equally had an equal effect on corporations and unions?
Yes.
So when you say you want, are they both working under the same personhood concept? And if you revoke the personhood, how does it affect things like unions and non-profit
Okay, so
corporations?
I just want to point out that you've asked 4 or 5 different questions in different ways. So I'm going to do my best to react to it. And if I didn't actually ask whatever your, the real question that you have, follow up. It's all good. It's all good. But I just want to point out, in that case, that's because these dominant institutions known as transnational corporations have not been subject to the appropriate political discussion and discourse. We don't even understand how they operate. That's kind of a problem, right? I mean, they're so powerful. So let me say it this way. Number 1, there is clearly a difference between a for-profit corporation and a not-for-profit corporation and a trade union. Those are different entities, but they're all collections of individuals, but they come together for different reasons, right? There's also a huge difference between a for-profit corporation that operates with 50, 100 employees and ones that are the transnational corporations that are dominating all aspects of international culture or international trade. I mean, those are different too. So we should recognize that there are huge differences. Now, the Citizens United case, which this gentleman is referring to, is the most recent example of corporations claiming constitutional rights, but it's not the only problem. I want to be very clear. I know that corporate money in elections is a huge problem, but it's not the only problem, right? It's not the only problem with corporate constitutional rights, because corporate constitutional rights allow corporate lawyers to also overturn environmental laws and public safety laws and health laws and worker protection laws and so forth. So let's just be very clear that even if we got corporate money completely out of elections, we wouldn't be through, right? The last thing that I'll say is this, that it is true that the Supreme Court said that in Citizens United, all wealthy people, both the Koch brothers and George Soros, can spend unlimited amounts of money. So I can spend just as much as the Koch brothers or George Soros. And it also said that unions and for-profit corporations and other entities can both spend as much as they can on trying to influence elections. And any trade unionist who actually thinks for a moment that trade unions could ever match the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and ExxonMobil and Pfizer and the other transnational corporations is delusional. So I would say this. Only actual individual human beings have inherently constitutionally protected rights. And all of the other legal rights and how different entities ought to operate is subject to the political process. And we ought to hash it out in the political process what sort of statutory rights a union would have, what sort of statutory rights a corporation would have, what sort of statutory rights a nonprofit corporation would have. These are all things that should be hashed out as part of the democratic process. See, at the end of the day, I believe in popular sovereignty. We, the people, will figure all of this out together collectively with one very important